Recently, a lot of you guys have been telling me, Dave, you should review Kenshi. And I mean, if you look at my old 2013 Weebars channel URL, it's got Kenshi in it. So I mean, of course I'm gonna review this game. So what is Kenshi? Well, it's a bit of a mess, but it's also a pretty goddamn good game. Kenshi is a sandbox RPG developed by Lo-Fi Games that drops you off in the map that'd fit right in a battle royale if it weren't so massive. It then gives you a kick up the arse and lets you figure out what the hell it is you're meant to do next. But that's the thing, there isn't anything you're meant to do. The game doesn't force a narrative upon you and lets you know that you're not special. You're free to go out and do whatever the hell you want. You're stuck in this apocalyptic weeaboo Mad Max world and it's up to you how you want to go about it. You can be a trader, a farmer, a bounty hunter, pretty much anything you want to be within the limitations of the game engine. It's kinda like Mountain Blade and also kinda like RimWorld, but what Kenshi does best is give you a nice big open and accessible world to play in, as well as plenty of opportunity and freedom to play how you want. And while the game might struggle in some aspects, it stays true to its concept and it pays off. Sometimes you'll be able to settle down and build a thriving settlement, others you will go off on a grand adventure only to be eaten alive by giant monsters. But I guess that's all just part of Kenshi's charm. Probably the biggest thing overshadowing this game is its janky ass graphics and just ugly look in general, but if you're able to power through the first impressions and being dropped into the thick of it, there's a pretty goddamn good sandbox RPG to be found in Kenshi. Now, if you've seen my Starbound video, you'd know how I hounded it for being a horrid mix of a sandbox and an RPG. So that'd make Kenshi, a sandbox RPG, a bad game, right? Not at all, Starbound is just bad on its own. Firstly, a sandbox RPG can definitely work, and for me there's one massive criteria to ensure that it does. Don't shoehorn a dumbass linear storyline into the game. Kenshi is a perfect example of how to be a great sandbox and also incorporate many RPG aspects and allow plenty of room for, well, role-playing. This game has no specific goal or path that you must follow. You're not the chosen one, and in fact the game goes out of its way to tell you that you're not special. You can do whatever the hell you like within the limitations of the game engine, which is exactly what a sandbox should allow you to do. It also incorporates many RPG aspects such as skills that can be trained, gear and equipment with different stats and bonuses, squads and character management, and so forth. And these aspects do not detract or distract you from the sandbox nature of the game, but rather embellish it. So fuck you, Starbound. Literally any excuse to rat on you and I'll take it. Anyway, back to Kenshi. When I first started playing the game, I had little idea what to do or where to go. I figured that was kinda the point, so I read some of the tutorials it just nonchalantly throws at you and went from there. The game suggested to go mining to gather some materials and maybe sell them for money, so I went mining. I waited for a moment, watching my guy just slap the rock with his janky ass animation, waiting for the ore to be mined. So I turned the speed up, waited a little longer. Then I was subsequently mobbed and beaten half to death by bandits. Then my guy decided he'd just shove his fist through his own face. They didn't even take any of my stuff, but the worst part of all, I still didn't get anything from all that mining. The next time I went out to mine, I was a little more careful, actually zooming out and being ready to pause if I saw any more random angry mobs heading my way. I guess the game makes you think more like that, especially early on. But what Kenshi does best is give you the option to do and be whatever the hell you want in this hellhole of a place you're dropped into. You can be a trader, a farmer, a bounty hunter, pretty much anything you want to be. You can even just be a slave if you really want to. Depends on how into roleplaying you are. A true sandbox, the game doesn't rely on a preset narrative to tell a story. Like RimWorld, like Dwarf Fortress, the stories that come about in Kenshi are organic. They're generated as you go by the game and its mechanics, which is fantastic. These factors, in my opinion, are the hallmark of a sandbox game. This game also has multiple different starting scenarios which complement different playstyles, which certainly helps with the game's replay value. The gameplay itself is quite fun and rewarding, but like a lot of other RPGs, Kenshi is quite a serious grind. Especially if you're doing a fair bit of base building like I did, you will be getting that bread the hard way, whether through mining, hunting, trading or farming. Be prepared for a bit of a grind fest. There's also a fair bit of travel time, which is lessened by the ability to change the game speed, though it's not always wise to be sitting on max speed as you might get harassed by bandits or an angry faction should you not be careful. The map itself is really goddamn big, which I guess could be a good thing, but it is just filled with a lot of emptiness. I get that it's a post-apocalyptic Mad Max world just without the big ass cars, but a lot of the map just wasn't worth anyone's time. With the big map came some pretty long load times, and the game kinda freaked out a little bit when switching between squads that were separated over a distance, so the game didn't really seem all that well optimized in that regard. One mechanic I liked quite a lot was the base building. Again, it could be a little grindy without just spending all your money on materials, but the research progression was nice, and it was cool to be able to carve out my little settlement and have the world interact with it. Depending on where you settled, different events would happen. Like when I settled near the Holy Boys, they always came down to make me say a prayer with them, and the one time I didn't because I was busy being raided by bandits, they came down and beat the shit out of all of my hired mercenaries. The combat is pretty decent, though a little RNG based. It certainly fleshed out once you had a bigger squad, but early game, you just spent a lot of time running from your problems rather than facing them. Some of the other mechanics appeared to be kinda broken. I think it was partially down to the AI. The first time my settlement was raided, all of the raiders just crammed into my shack and stayed there for ages. I even sent one of my guys up right behind them and walked into them, and nothing seemed to happen. Eventually, after quite a long time, they just kinda wandered off. They didn't take anything because the game told me they were coming, so I just emptied my chest and went back into the nearby town before they got there. Overall, while I thought that the AI was pretty decent, I did find it to be quite exploitable, as such with the previous example. They did have a knack of getting stuck behind stuff too, which was also quite interesting. What I would have liked to see from this game is more fleshed out characters, perhaps RimWorld style, with personal traits and such that affected how they performed in certain scenarios, or perhaps how they got along with one another, because all of the different characters and units were pretty one-dimensional other than their actual stats. Speaking of characters, the character creator is an absolute meme. It looks like it was just partially stolen from Mount & Blade and the other part stolen from Oblivion. Jesus Christ, you can make some abominations in this game. Honestly, I'd probably just spend a quarter of my time in Kenshi just messing around in the character creator. It was probably the best part of the game altogether. You could also edit each new squad member when you hired them, so naturally I distorted most of them and called them Jeff. And while I purposefully distorted my characters' models, they didn't look particularly great to begin with. Now that I mention it, not a whole lot of this game looks good when you think about it. Certainly the most lacking part of Kenshi would be its visuals. From the texturing and models that make up the map to the janky ass player and character models to the clunky and ugly UI, there's not a lot to love about how this game looks. And look, I understand that the visuals aren't the most crucial part of a game like this, and that there was a very limited development team that worked on the game, but that doesn't make the visuals any better. They were still bad enough to be a pretty big talking point about it, and certainly a bit of a deterrent when you first started up. I did say that this game was kinda like Mount & Blade, right? Well, it also looks a fair bit like it. And that's not a compliment for a game that officially came out at the end of 2018. While I think that the map and how it is sectioned is fine, the texturing and model work really don't do it justice. It's low res and lacking polygons. A lot of the time it genuinely looks like a mod for a Source Engine game. I also found that in certain areas of the map the camera was obscured and blocked by stuff, and it got a little funky when going over steep elevation, which certainly didn't help anything. The character animations were all pretty choppy, from the running animations to the combat animations. I think that goofing around in the character creator made this even worse. And while I loved goofing around with the character creator, I won't lie and say that the player models look good, because they don't. They look pretty average, maybe a little nicer than Mount & Blade, but still not great. You remember when I talked about how I didn't like the UI in RimWorld? Well, when I was greeted by this absolute gem of a main menu screen, RimWorld didn't seem quite as bad. Jesus Christ, it's like UI development has just devolved back several years. It took quite a while to get used to it, but it still hurts my eyes. Very janky, not very intuitive. The game could have done with some more hotkeys or perhaps an idle squad member button, as I was also constantly pressing 1, 2 and 3 to change the game speed to no avail. I just assumed that that was pretty standard in games that allow you to change the game speed, but Kenshi subverted my expectations once more. The game in general is just not very nice to look at. The visuals are all very, very rough around the edges and is certainly one of the biggest downsides of Kenshi. Like Mount & Blade, the visuals are bad enough that it's almost endearing. I did find that I was just making characters look ridiculous or being silly in general because of it, so in a way it's kind of a bonus. The music was pretty non-existent outside of the main menu. It barely came up in game, and when it did, it wasn't particularly memorable. There wasn't a whole lot of notable sound in general, to be honest. So in the end, Kenshi ends up being a bit of a mess. More so visually, as gameplay wise I found it to be pretty damn entertaining, but certainly the visuals and optimization leave a lot to be desired. And look, you can say, but actually it was only made by a small team of endangered orangutans in a garage in Mexico, so that's why the visuals are bad. But while the small dev team might explain the reason for the game having bad graphics, it does not excuse it. The team could have gone for a more achievable stylistic choice rather than the half-assed Source Engine mod design they went for. Take a classic example, Minecraft. Initially developed by one lonely Swedish man, doesn't have cutting edge graphics, but it's fitting for the world, it's stylized. These days, it's iconic. The looks of Kenshi, however, will never be iconic. It will forever be the game that looks even worse than Mountain Blade did when it came out almost 10 years prior. And even it looked kinda bad for its time. But while the visuals might be lacking, the gameplay isn't. Kenshi does a great job at sticking to its concept of being a brutal yet rewarding RPG experience, while also being a great sandbox and giving the player plenty of freedom to tackle the world however the hell they want to. There's no one true way to play Kenshi, and you can have a totally different experience every time you play. There's plenty of replayability in this game, and it can tell a totally different story on each playthrough. Some of the mechanics are still a little bit iffy, and the AI could do with a bit of a polish, but the core of the gameplay is solid and it gives you all the tools you need to get it done. Plus, these guys here look kinda like whoopers. So I mean, that's also pretty good. It's not very cheap. In fact, it's not very cheap at all, especially in comparison to other games in this genre, but there still is a lot of good things about Kenshi. If you're not convinced, I'd consider buying it should it go on sale. You might have to power through it a bit at the start as you wrap your head around the horrid UI you've just had to put up with and the fact that the game kinda just throws you in the deep end. But stick with this game and it will reward you for your efforts. Because under the initial impression of a janky mess that the game gives off, there's surprising depth, plenty of freedom, and a lot to like about Kenshi.